It's a real pleasure for me to be here at IIT Kanpur today for a variety of reasons. One is several of your distinguished alumni have been friends and people whom I admire greatly. Of course, there's Mr. Narayan Murthy, whom we all know. I've had the privilege of working very closely with him in my banking career, with him, of course, in his role at Infosys. But also other people like Satyendra Dubey, your very famous alumnus who I think has set hallmark for what activism can be. Of course, Dr. Subbarao, who was governor of the Reserve Bank and with whom I worked very closely, Som Mittal, president of NASSCOM, and of course, one of your younger alumni, Nandan, who is with me in Aam Aadmi Party as one of the people who has journeyed with us on this path. So as I said, it's really wonderful to be here with you. And when I was invited by your colleagues to be at this festival, I said, well, what would people like to hear? And they said to me, well, you know, you can talk about banking, you can talk about politics, you can really talk about both of them together. And so what I want to share with you today is why I believe banking matters, why I believe politics matters, and most importantly, why I believe you matter. And that's what I would like to spend a few minutes talking about. And then if there's still time, we can have some questions and answers. So I'd like to start by asking you in the audience to raise your hands if you are planning to live and work in India after you finish your studies, your engineering studies. But that is fantastic. I'm really so happy to see so many hands. And the second question I'd like to ask is, please raise your hand if you are planning to start your own enterprise to be an entrepreneur when you finish your engineering studies. So not as many hands, but still a great deal. And you know, before we do anything, please give yourselves a big round of applause. Because I can tell you that this show of hands was certainly not the case when I was a student, and it was not even the case as recently as 5, 6, 7 years ago. And what you represent, I believe, is a new India, an India which is really changing for the better. So I'd like to just share a little bit about my story and then lead into the topics that I talked about. I'm the daughter of a naval officer, and there are two things associated with that. The first is that I grew up in a very idealistic family. My father was a very idealistic person. He is no longer with us. My mother is a very brilliant lawyer. She never practiced. She always said she'd invested her education in us, my brother and myself. And the two things that marked our childhood was, first, we moved a lot of schools. So someone was asking me, one of your colleagues, they said, where did you go to school? And it was almost everywhere. So every few years we changed schools, and that was, I think, a very nice thing, because the consequences that you have friends really across the country and across everywhere. But the other thread which ran through our childhood was, I remember my father telling us almost constantly that we had to grow up and serve our country. And for many years I struggled with that. I didn't really know how I would serve my country, but it was at the back of my mind. And then when we were sitting in the green room and sitting around, I was asking your friends what they would do when they graduated, or why they had chosen engineering, why they'd chosen to come to IIT Kanpur. And the answers I heard reminded me a lot of myself when I was a student. I knew what I didn't want to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I chose the options that I believed would leave me the maximum amount of choice. And I wasn't as brilliant as all of you, so I couldn't choose engineering. But I tried to, choose a field which would leave those options open. And so I chose commerce, and then I went on and did my MBA. initially at IIM Calcutta, and then I dropped out of there and I went abroad to INSEAD. And in those days, and this goes back many years, I graduated in 1983. And when I finished, the one thing I knew I did want to do was I did want to come back to India. But going back to those days, and this is probably the generation of your parents, I found that was a very hard thing to do. So INSEAD in those days, as it is now, is recognized as a good business school. And so I had job offers. I had a job offer in France, I had a job offer in Sweden, and they were both good jobs, and I would have been quite happy doing either of those things. One, in fact, was in a, I would say, engineering manufacturing company called Electrolux. The other was in banking in the BNP. But I said, no, I'd like to go back to India and see, and work there. And as I said, this was incredibly hard because, of course, in India in those days, nobody went to France to do an MBA. Of course, you went to America. And so as I started going for interviews, people said, oh, you went to France to study French. And I said, no. They said, oh, you must have gone to study art. And I said, no. And then when I'd say I'd gone to study management, they'd look at you and say, oh, who is this crazy person? Why go to France? And then they'd said, okay, why are you here? And I said, I've come, for a job. And then you could sense in their eyes, this person is such a loser. Who comes back to India? Because in those days you had really a lot of people going abroad, but nobody ever wanted to come back because there was not a lot to come back to. It took me about 6 months to find a job. And finally, the way I did it, I went back to IIM Cal. IIM Cal is a 2-year program. INSEAD was a 1-year intensive program. And I went to the dean, who was a wonderful gentleman by the name of Ramu Iyer. And I said, sir, I'm really struggling. And in that weekend, I still remember, about 80% of my batch got placed. And I said, I've made a very big mistake. If I'd wanted to live and work in India, I should have stayed on here. But he was a very generous man. He said, yes, Meera, why don't you come and, finish your MBA here? And I said, no, sir, 1 MBA is enough. I certainly don't want 2. So he says, what do you want? I said, can I please put on my CV that I am 19th PGDM of IIM Cal? And he said, yes, of course, because you are 19th PGDM of IIM Cal. The batch hadn't passed out, I hadn't passed out, so he said, you can do that. And that's how I got my first interview calls. And that's how I was then offered a few jobs. And one of them was a job with Grindlays Bank, and that's how I became a banker. So I guess there are some of you here who are accidental engineers. I can certainly tell you, I'm an accidental banker. And so I started my banking career in 1984, and I gave it up exactly 30 years later. But during my banking career, I learned one thing. And as I said, that is that banking matters. Why does it matter? It matters because banking is the lifeblood of an economic system. And I believe that if bankers do their jobs properly, and what is their job? Their job is to help other people make money. That is the fundamental job of a banker. You provide the ability to an entrepreneur or someone who's saving or someone who has assets to use that money in a productive way to produce more goods and services to help the economy run better. Would you agree with that? That's what the basic job of a banker is. And somewhere down the line, I think banking took a different turn. Lots of engineers in banking, lots of financial engineering in banking. And I saw the golden age of banking, and I also saw the worst days of banking. When I took over as CEO of RBS in India, I think banks were masters of the universe. Those were the days of multi-million-dollar bonuses, not just in Wall Street, but also in India. And then we had the global financial crisis. And, I don't want to dwell a lot on that because I'm sure you're all well aware of it. But I think the global financial crisis really came about for a very simple reason. And that reason was that the people who were involved in the banking and financial services industry lost sight of their basic purpose. Instead of helping other people make money, they started to focus on how they would maximize the money they made themselves. The focus became on bonuses, how to maximize bonuses, and a lot of very big mistakes were made. Mistakes in financial engineering, whether you look at the subprime crisis, mistake on ethics, which is why you have multi-billion-dollar fines, mistakes on mis-selling, really mistakes in a variety of ways, which shows that bankers had lost their way. Of course, someone asked them, why did you enter politics? And so I fast forward to the year 2008. As I said, this is the year which in my life it was a very significant year for two reasons. One is I had just taken over my bank, which was ABN AMRO Bank, had just been bought by the Royal Bank of Scotland. And the combination of the two banks created the largest bank in the world. It was such a big bank that it was bigger than the next smaller bank by 60%. So we were a global giant. The deal was done, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but the way the deal was done was almost an all-cash deal. RBS leveraged up its balance sheet just before the financial crisis. So in and of itself, it was not a bad acquisition, but the timing was fatal. And when the financial crisis hit, to have so much leverage on the books of RBS, we really saw the entire thing unraveling. As I said, I had just taken over as CEO, and much of what I had done in my banking career, applying the rules of what my dad had told me, I struggled through the years and said, all right, how do I serve my country? So let me make sure that at least the projects that I finance are good for our country. And there is something which is called the Equator Principles that ABN AMRO was a founder of, but RBS was also a subscriber to, which said that every project we finance will meet certain ethical, social, and environmental norms, what we call the ESG filters. And those are actually very good guidelines, and I felt that they held us in good stead. And I felt very privileged during the course of my career to have been part of the financing of India's telecoms, the power sector, the oil and gas sector, and that was wonderful. And during those years, we also had the opportunity to create a BPO and ITES company. And so for ABN AMRO and RBS, I had set up the global BPO, which at the time when I stepped down employed 14,000 people in India, servicing the entire world. So when we were looking at the banking crisis, my job was to keep the Indian ship afloat. And so I was working my way through that. And then on the 26th of November, we had the terrorist attacks in Mumbai. And in many ways, that to me was, I think it was for many people a very life-changing event. But certainly for me, I remember sitting in my room watching what was happening. And of course, we were invoking our business continuity and disaster protocols, just to give you an idea. On the day of the attack, I was not in Mumbai. I was actually in Delhi. And there was some award ceremony of a confederation of NGOs. It was at Rajghat. And they were giving me an award. And after that, with my family, any of you from Delhi here? Okay, so you know this wonderful restaurant, Kareem's in Old Delhi. So we had gone as a family to Delhi. My parents were in Delhi, and so I'd gone along with them. And my phone was on silent. So as I stepped out of the restaurant at 10:30, and it's a very crowded restaurant, I looked at my phone and I saw over 100 missed calls from the office, from the house, and I knew that something was happening. And then, we gradually were trying to figure out right through the night actually the impact of what it was. And we have very significant operations in Mumbai. We have, of course, branches, but we also had all our investment banking for the whole world was actually being processed out of Mumbai. We had 40 foreigners in the city, most of them staying at the Oberoi and the Taj. Fortunately, not a lot of them were in the hotels at that time. 5 people were trapped there. 14 of my staff were trapped in my office, which was just behind the Oberoi, etc. And so through the night we were working, And by 6 o'clock in the morning, all our 2,500 people in Mumbai were accounted for. We knew they were safe. We knew their families were safe. We knew where the foreigners were. We knew who was in the hotel. We knew who was in the office. We knew that 4 Canadian tourists had fled from the Oberoi, had taken refuge in our office. And this was not unusual. I think most companies who have business continuity protocols would have been in the same situation. But the situation in the public domain was completely different. Many of you, does any of you remember 26/11? Yeah? You must have been quite young at that time, but it was horrific. And I compared to what we saw during the 9/11 attacks on New York. You know, terrorism is a bad thing and it can happen everywhere. But what you can control is your response to it. And if you recall the way, you were even younger, but Mayor Giuliani in New York, he had taken control of the situation. They knew what was happening. They knew it was a very bad thing that was happening, but they were controlling the situation. Regrettably, in Mumbai, there was no one in charge. The chief minister wasn't in charge. The mayor certainly wasn't in charge. The sheriff wasn't in charge. The municipal commissioner wasn't in charge. The police commissioner wasn't in charge. There was complete chaos. And I could not fly back from Delhi to Mumbai because the airports had been closed, so we were sitting and managing on the phone. And as I was sitting with my father, he said to me, you know, there was one very horrific moment where our commandos were going down, you know, on helicopter over Shabad House. And this was being broadcast live on television. And he said, what are they doing? Because the people sitting inside obviously could have access to a television. Our men are sitting ducks. Later, you know, in the day, I was talking to my people, my staff who were trapped in the office, and as I said, it was just behind the Oberoi. It was my head of treasury there, and I remember I was speaking to them every hour, and they were taking it very well, they were being very mature. But at one stage, this head of treasury, who was a very good guy, he broke down, he was crying on the phone. He said, Meera, I can't take it anymore. And I said, what has happened? I mean, calm down. And he says, I can see the people in the Oberoi because, you know, the terrorists had started setting fire to the rooms and the rooms were filling with smoke. And he said, I can see these people banging on the windows. And I said, okay, calm down, call the fire engine. And he said, I have called the fire engine. And I said, well, then what's happening? He said, the fire engine is parked around the corner. And I said, well, why aren't they coming forward? And he says, because there's no one in charge. They don't have permission to move. So this was the situation in Mumbai, which is actually a very efficient city. The police is very efficient. The administration is very efficient. But nobody was talking to each other. It wasn't being well managed. There was no leadership. And at that point, on that day, I said that I am no longer going to be a spectator. I'm not going to sit in my drawing room and watch these TV shows and analyze and criticize. I'm going to be part of the system because the system needs to change, and if we believe we can change the system, then we must enter it. And so I made the decision at that time to enter politics and to stand for elections. Now, of course, in 2009, this was a very crazy thing to do because nobody joined politics. I mean, nobody who was not a son or a daughter of a politician, nobody who was not a film star or a celebrity, nobody who was not a criminal. You know, these were the categories of people who used to go into politics. And so when I said I'm going to stand for elections, this was, you know, people just said, you're completely crazy. I mean, who does this kind of thing? Politics is for criminals, politics is for people who are corrupt. Why are you doing this? In fact, our governor, Raghuram Rajan, has written a lovely book called Fault Lines. I do recommend any of you who are interested in the banking world, economy, etc., do read it. But tucked away in the appendix at the back, he talks about the crazy banker who entered politics. And so when I met him when he took over as governor, I said, you know, hi, I'm that crazy person. But it was really regarded as a very crazy thing to do. What I'm really happy about is that now in 2013 and 14, it has become a very mainstream thing. That in 5 years, the needle of public opinion has shifted, that people like Nandan Nilekani, people like Jayant Sinha, and I hope one day people like you will take the step to enter electoral politics, not for the power, not for the money, but to serve your country. Because politics matters. Just as banking matters, politics matters. And I believe the reason that is so, and let's not talk about politics and politicians, but let's say, why do politics and politicians exist? It is for governance. And the job of government and governance, I believe, is to create the enabling circumstances so that normal, ordinary people can live in safety, can go about their lives and fulfill their potential. Just as bankers have lost their way, I believe politics and politicians have lost their way. Instead of focusing on their prime task, which is to create those enabling circumstances for the people of that city or that country, politicians, regrettably, and not just in India, I think everywhere in the world, have started focusing, like bankers, on enriching themselves, but also their unitary focus has become on getting re-elected. And I think that's one of the reasons that politicians and politics have lost their way. But it doesn't take away from the basic tenets of what I believe, that just as banking matters for an economy to flourish, politics matters for an economy, for a people, for a nation to flourish. But as I said, there were three aspects to it. And the third is, the most important thing is that you matter. And you've really made me so happy by your show of hands, because if people like you invest your future in this country, and invest, so many of you intend to invest your future in becoming entrepreneurs, then India is in safe hands. Now, I will tell you another story. As a child, as a family, we traveled a lot. We often took road trips. We often took, of course, train trips. And I remember, when the Great Famine of 69-70 was taking place, going by train from Mumbai to Delhi, Bombay as it was then called. And I have never forgotten that memory, because at station after station, trains were just packed with people, on the roof, out, hanging out of the doors, hanging out of the windows. People were just fleeing. It was just terrible. And as we were going past, you could see skeletons on the sides of the track. And my brother, who's 4 years older than me, he used to, tease me, and he would say, "Oh, those are human skeletons." I don't believe that. It was probably, cattle. But it was a horrific thing. And that image has stayed with me all my life. I often asked myself, when will that time come for India, like it came for the United States after the Great Depression, like it came for Japan after the World War, when you have that massive explosion of wealth and opportunity which allows a nation to move forward. And I believe that time is now for India. We are entering the golden age of this country. We may not have this opportunity for a very long time, and we haven't had it for several hundred years. What we talk about in terms of our demographic dividend. Now is the time that can yield a dividend, when you have your productivity ratios which are favorable.